Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our July 17th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode takes us across the pond for a conversation about the state of agriculture in the United Kingdom and the possible implications for farmers here in Iowa. Last month, the Iowa Farm Bureau sent 20 farmers to England and Scotland for a week-long tour of UK agriculture. From Brexit to trade and regulations, our tour group gathered plenty of insights throughout the week, and we're excited to share those with you, our podcast listeners. Spokesman editor Tom Block joined the international market study trip with Iowa Farm Bureau economist Dr. Christopher Pudens, who led the tour. Let's start with their conversation after returning home earlier this month.
Christopher, last month you led a group of Farm Bureau members on a market study tour of England and Scotland. Can you give us a general outline of the purpose of the trip and some of the places you visited?
Yes, absolutely. For this year's market study tour, we spent 8 days traveling through the UK, the United Kingdom. We flew into London in the southern part of the island of Britain there in England and spent 2 days there before moving north through the countryside into Scotland. We finished with a couple days in Scotland in the Edinburgh area, including 1 day at the Royal Highland Show, which was a real treat. Our purpose of the trip was twofold. First, we wanted to learn about the British exit from the European Union, very commonly called Brexit. Specifically, we wanted to learn about the motivations for the vote to leave back in 2016, and also what opportunities and challenges had arisen after the official departure in 2020. Second, we wanted to explore future trade opportunities between the U.S. and the United Kingdom in the wake of this Brexit. We especially wanted to see if there was any potential for a trade deal between the U.S. and the U.K. going on into the future.
So what were some of your key takeaways or insights from the various meetings you had with farmers and others about UK agriculture?
Yeah, I think there were 4 key takeaways that I walked away with, at least from this trip. The first was an answer to our Brexit question. By and large, the takeaway is that this has been a mostly negative event for the agricultural community. There have been a lot of new costs and trade difficulties post-Brexit, and none of the promised benefits have really been capitalized on post-Brexit. Got an answer to our second question regarding trade, and that answer is that there seems to be little appetite from the UK agricultural community for a trade deal going forward with the US, especially following the implementation of trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand. There could be some potential for something in the long term, say 5 to 10 years out, but there doesn't seem to be much potential for anything in the next 5 years, say. A couple things that we learned that I wasn't necessarily expecting to learn, but we picked up on these things all the way throughout the trip. One was the regulatory environment. Specifically, the regulatory environment in the UK, we found out, is exceedingly cumbersome. It is pervasive in all aspects of life, from things like where you can park your bus at London Heathrow Airport to various policies that impact agricultural production practices. In fact, some farmers that we talked to cited government regulation as the primary reason that UK agricultural production costs are so high relative to other parts of the world. The second thing that we picked up on throughout the week was related to food security. Specifically, food security, or perhaps I should say food insecurity, seems to be far less of a concern in the UK than in the US, with large swaths of the government and the general population not really understanding the importance of agricultural production to the UK's economy or to the society more broadly.
You mentioned one of the themes at almost every stop was Brexit, and it maybe hasn't turned out the way they thought. I think originally farmers voted in favor of Brexit, but as we found out in the years since, it hasn't come to fruition of what they thought it might be. What were some of the specific impacts that Brexit is having on UK agriculture, and how are farmers adapting?
Yeah, one farmer group that we talked to said that before the Brexit vote happened, people didn't really sit down to have a good think, quote unquote, about what the potential impacts could be. And some of those impacts have been pretty negative. One of these specific impacts has been an increase in non-tariff trade barriers and regulations post-Brexit. Specifically, though the UK has a trade agreement with the EU, non-tariff trade barriers and regulations are in place that make trading with the European continent more difficult than it was before. Before, it was as easy as putting something on a truck, sending it underneath the channel tunnel, the channel they call it, and the product would arrive in France. Now, we spoke to one group at the Royal Highlands show that said additional paperwork post-Brexit adds 24 to 36 hours of shipping time to exports headed to continental Europe. It's not nearly as easy as it was before. These folks also indicated that resultingly, the meat export business from the UK into continental Europe has consolidated into just 5 to 6 large companies that have the infrastructure to handle this paperwork that the smaller companies no longer are able to handle. Additionally, one cattle breeder remarked that though live cattle can come into the UK from continental Europe relatively easily, exporting live cattle from the UK to Europe has become very difficult, if not impossible. A lot of trade to the continent, instead of going right under the English Channel or across the English Channel like it did before, now runs through Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. There it crosses from Northern Ireland into Ireland, where it enters the European Union, and then it can be transferred to France or wherever on the European continent. So there are a lot more hoops to jump through that really make these non-tariff trade barriers a serious issue going forward. The second thing that farmers are dealing with post-Brexit is persistent labor issues. A lot of labor for intensive industries used to come from Eastern Europe. Before Brexit, it was essentially as easy as an Iowan traveling to Nebraska. There was a sign that said, "Welcome to the United Kingdom," but there was no real border. Now that freedom of movement in this way has ended, there are really meaningful labor shortages, especially in horticulture or vegetable industries where intensive labor is needed in order to package beets, like we saw at one beet farm that we went to. Finally, the end of the Common Agricultural Policy that was part of the European Union has caused problems for farmers in the United Kingdom. Specifically, when the UK was part of the EU, farmers used to get direct payments, subsidies, based on the land area that they farmed. And one farming group that we talked to said that 50% of farmers in England are or would be running at a loss without these direct payments that they used to get through the EU. Scotland, for their part, has essentially continued the same approach as the EU Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP system, where they are just distributing payments based on land area farmed. But England going forward is adopting this public money for public goods approach, which will pay farmers for implementing various conservation measures and environmental practices. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing for agriculture, but there is concern in the agricultural community that it could be detrimental or even likely will be detrimental for the ag community going forward. We heard it said that the next 12 months or so will be critical for how exactly this policy regime takes shape, what the details are, what practices are subsidized, what practices aren't. And you can bet that the agricultural community is watching this closely and is engaged as best as it can be to make sure that agriculture's voice doesn't get drowned out by environmental activists who also have a stake in shaping this policy going forward.
Yeah, it's a little interesting. The United Kingdom itself is made up of 4 countries. So they work collectively, but each do have a little bit of freedom to set up their own agricultural policies.
Yes, that is the case. So they have a system of government called the devolved system of government, where there is one parliament in London, and that parliament is also England's parliament, but Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland all have some independence underneath that umbrella government that covers those 4 devolved nations that we discussed. So that gives the English folks opportunity to implement their post-Brexit approach, their public money for public goods approach, whereas, like I said, Scotland, for the time being, is just wholesale implementing essentially what the EU used to do in Scotland in terms of subsidy payments.
And it'll be up to those various governments to find the money and find the will to do it. And we also found it with the farm groups. The National Farmers Union that we met with in London represents Wales and England, but Scotland has its own farm group. Just talk about the dynamics of that a little bit.
Yeah, so like you said, England and Wales have their own National Farmers Union. We went to their offices in London, in the Westminster area. They were very hospitable to us. They fielded lots of questions. They provided lots of information. We learned a lot in that meeting. And those folks, they're in the thick of it right now. They are right in the middle of figuring out what this public money for public goods policy regime will look like in detail, like what that means for farmers who are out in the English countryside farming wheat or raising sheep. Now, when we went to Scotland, some of our members talked to the Scottish National Farmers Union folks up in Edinburgh at the Royal Highland Show. And those folks, they aren't exactly fighting the same battles that the English National Farmers Union is right now. The Scottish NFU folks, they are at this point more able to kind of sit back and say, we told you Brexit was a bad idea. Scotland, by and large, voted to stay in the European Union, whereas England, at least percentage-wise, voted to leave. So talking to the Scottish National Farmers Union folks, they seem far less concerned about current policy debates because their local devolved government, the Scottish Parliament, just decided to implement what the EU essentially used to do. And they aren't exactly surprised by how things have unfolded the same way that folks in England and Wales seem to be a little bit surprised by how things have unfolded post-Brexit.
You mentioned that trade for them has become much more difficult with the own continent of the European Union. Do you see any opportunities for increased trade with Iowa or U.S. ag products with the UK?
Great question. Unfortunately, in the short term, I don't think so. There doesn't really seem to be much interest for a trade deal from the agricultural community in the United Kingdom, largely due to the recent Australian and New Zealand free trade deals. Talking with a lot of folks throughout the week in the UK, the ag community there feels like they really got the short end of the stick in those trade deals, and they aren't really keen for a trade deal with an efficient producer like the United States. That said, I do see the potential for more U.S. pork to be sent to the UK in the medium or long term, especially due to the reduced production in continental Europe with the drawdown of their hog herds there.
You've mentioned a couple times the surprising or intense regulatory environment that UK farmers operate under. Give some examples of those. I know one of the stops was at a farm that was putting forth all types of environmental structures and hedgerows, and the focus seemed to be much more environmentally focused as opposed to efficiency.
In general, as I've mentioned, with examples like where buses can park at airports and things like that, government regulation in the UK is far more pervasive in all areas of life. There doesn't really seem to be any relief on that front anytime soon, especially in the agricultural industries, especially with this new subsidy framework, this public money for public goods approach. And as is often the case, regulations are like a ratchet, and they only ratchet one direction. In this case, in the United Kingdom, they seem to be ratcheting up, especially in England. One of the stops we made was at a farm in the English countryside near Cambridge, where the famous university is. And we stopped at the farm of a gentleman named Martin Lyons, and he has implemented all these various volunteer conservation practices, some of which are pretty over the top, especially in England. He had all these flower strips that he had planted down the middle of his fields. He had beetle banks. He had these hedgerows. He had all these various practices that were aimed at increasing, say, the beauty of his farm and the environmental appeal of his farm, in many cases at the expense of production and yield. One of the things that he talked about was how right now he's getting paid by the government to do these things. But going forward under this new system, there's going to be subsidies for these things, but eventually those subsidies could dry up. He said right now it's a carrot, ultimately it could be a stick. And so he wants to be ready in case that carrot goes away and it does become a stick, and he has to implement these practices whether he wants to or not. And quite frankly, the British populace really likes these things, and they really wouldn't mind if they were regulated. And at the same time, they probably wouldn't be too excited about consuming food produced according to lesser requirements from other countries, even if those lesser requirements are scientifically grounded and widely accepted in the country of origin. So, bringing things back to trade a little bit, when questions of trade do come up, it's very important to both British farmers and the British consumers that imported food has to meet the same requirements as food produced in Britain domestically under those pretty strict regulatory regimes. This was one of the big frustrations with the Australia and New Zealand free trade deals as we traveled through the countryside and talked to various farmers. And it was also one of the hurdles that UK and US trade negotiators couldn't get over during the waning years of the Trump administration when they were negotiating a free trade deal that ultimately didn't come to fruition. The UK presently seems way more excited about trade deals with small, populous countries like Switzerland or countries in the Middle East that don't have much in the way of domestic agricultural production that would compete with their domestic agriculture the same way that US agriculture would.
One of your stops was at the Royal Highland Show, which has been taking place for more than 200 years. What was that like? What were some of the highlights that you saw at that show?
Yeah, that show was really, really fascinating. It was almost like a Scottish equivalent of the Iowa State Fair, with even more emphasis on livestock. You walk in the center of these Royal Highland Show grounds are a giant arena where they are doing the large draft horse showing. So, like I said, like the Iowa State Fair with even more emphasis on livestock and with this giant machinery show that you really don't see anywhere else except maybe like the Farm Progress show or something. So really impressive. And it was also just a tribute to all things Scotland too. There were Scottish Highland cattle, and we got to talk to a producer of Scottish Highland cattle and hear about what we had to say. There was an international sheep shearing competition going on, so some of our member participants, wandered in there and watched that for a bit. There were Scottish dancers who just, were walking down the pathway, then they stopped and started dancing right in front of where we happened to be sitting. There was a bagpipe marching band. There was a giant building called the Larder where they had all these different booths with various examples of Scottish cuisine and drink that you got to try for free. All told, it was a day that was both fun and educational and probably a highlight of the trip for me. The organizers were really, really generous to kick off the day. We had a private tour of the grounds with a previous chair of the organization that organized the show. And he walked us around and took us into different tents and introduced us to different people. And a lot of the education that we got that day happened through that private tour that we had. So that was really kind of them to do that for us. Like I said, probably a highlight of the whole trip for me. And I think also a highlight of the whole trip for a lot of the participants as well.
Yeah, sort of sounds like an all-encompassing ag and cultural experience, which this trip really was. You not only learn a little bit more firsthand from the farmers, but you also get to taste a little bit of the culture and see what life there is really like. Why is it important to take these kind of trips and for Iowa farmers to participate and learn about things outside their farm and quite frankly, outside the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really important because, the reading and formal education and even watching documentaries and things like that are really important. There are just so many things that you can't learn about a place or about a culture like Scottish culture unless you visit there and you get boots on the ground. And with complex issues like Brexit or trade, it really is those details, the seemingly small things that end up mattering so much. Like the fact that I cited about Brexit, it now takes an additional 24 to 36 hours for UK producers to send exports to continental Europe. That type of fact is nearly impossible to find on the internet someplace. You have to actually talk to a farmer or an exporter who has experienced that themselves, and then they have that firsthand knowledge that they can communicate to you if you ask them about it. For a trade example, one UK farmer told us that he'd never had a bad steak at a restaurant in the United States, whereas he'd had plenty of bad steaks at restaurants in the United Kingdom. And another cattle farmer told us that American cattle genetics are just better than UK cattle genetics, like it wasn't even a question to him. And this was a guy who focused on very high quality breeding and genetics, so he knew what he was talking about. And this type of comment raises the question, if UK consumers could just get a taste of high quality US red meat, is there an opportunity for trade there in the future? There might be, in the medium to long run. Like I've said, the politics of the situation sort of preclude any short run trade agreement, but could there be some sort of opportunity for US red meat in the UK in the medium to long run? I think so, especially if those quality differences are as stark as those people who really know what they're talking about were able to communicate to us. So when you have an opportunity to go to a place and ask hard questions to people of various backgrounds, like we did in the Market Study Tour, and you get these good, solid answers from people who are in it every day and know what they're talking about the same way that Iowa's farmers are in it every day and know what they're talking about in terms of Iowa agriculture, you're going to walk away learning something. And then you're able to bring that back and share it with your family and your friends and your county farm bureau and various clubs and organizations that you work with, and really have a positive impact by communicating that local knowledge from the UK and your local community here in Iowa. So all told, I really highly recommend applying for future market study tours. Next year's is already in the works. We're excited to announce that as soon as we're able. So look for that going forward.
It's more than a little frustrating to hear Dr. Puden say that he doesn't see any trade deals with the UK coming soon. But you've got to feel good about the international perception of U.S. beef and other U.S. ag products. That reputation for quality is something our farmers can take pride in, and it's a clear advantage as we work to open up more markets for U.S. ag products around the globe. Okay, you've heard from our economist. Now let's hear from a couple of farmers who made the trip. Dave and Pam Bolin have a dairy farm up in northeast Iowa, and they were 2 of the 20 Iowa farmers who had a chance to immerse themselves in UK agriculture during last month's tour. Recently, Spokesman editor Tom Block gave them a call to hear what stood out for them during that experience.
Dave and Pam, to start things off, can you tell me what were your overall impressions of agriculture in the United Kingdom?
My first impression flying into London Heathrow was looking out the window and seeing the smaller fields all lined with hedges and irregular shapes, not a square field to be seen. Then in talking with our first farmer, realizing that they have even more government influence, regulations, environmental restrictions than we have here.
I think the other thing that I found was a lot different than farming in Iowa was on the first day of our meetings when we met with the National Farmers Union and their farmer representative. His name is David also, but he shared how his farm he has 12 million people within 30 miles of him. And that's definitely something we don't experience. And not only a lot of people in the area, but people who feel that the farms are there for them and they have a right to roam and even come and get on your farm whenever they like. So I'm thankful that's not happening around us yet.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit. I think every stop we went to, Brexit was a topic of conversation. Sort of, they went into it with high hopes, but now it's coming back on them where there's a lot of uncertainty regarding how the government is going to support the farmers.
I picked up on, it was a close vote, as I remember, and I think they went into it that they kind of felt like they wanted to keep their own identity as an island nation and have their own products, from the UK. Pretty much to a farmer, especially in Scotland, I don't think we found a Scottish farmer that didn't feel that they should have stayed with the EU.
Another thing that we learned is that leave the EU not only upset the smoothness of trade, but also now all the rules that were part of that are gone. And the farmers are now waiting to see what are our rules? What are our restrictions? How can we trade? And yeah. I think that's, as he said to us, and this was Nick, the staff person with NFU, he said, we were there at a great time, though, because they're at a point of great uncertainty, but they felt they had a lot of opportunities. They just had to figure out how to move forward with this lack of trade freedom and the lack of rules.
Yeah, I think the EU had a support system in place that enabled the farmers to get some money to help out, and the UK is still formulating how they're going to replace that.
You mentioned trade, and they're having difficulty even just trading with their former partners in the EU. Did you get a sense from anyone what their perspective is as far as trading maybe with the United States? I know they've recently made some agreements with Australia and New Zealand that they don't feel like we're all that favorable. So how did they feel about maybe our efforts to make a trade agreement with them?
Well, I remember one of the things that one of the gentlemen told us is that we're kind of late to the party, so we might be off the table for now. I also found later when we talked to one of the beef farmers, they thought maybe pork would be a good thing for us to trade with them, but I found it interesting he has no pork. So I'm not sure they're real open to trading with us right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a huge demand for mutton, sheep. I think they felt like they have an edge over us, to be able to supply that market. I think we definitely have more products and lower cost and higher quality products. And yeah, there's not going to be a trade agreement with them in the near future.
Talk about all the different things that you saw and maybe pick up what was the highlight of the trip for each of you.
I think the highlight for me was getting to go to the Royal Highlands show in Edinburgh. Just the opportunity to see a large exhibition in a foreign country, to be an international guest. We were allowed to meet and greet and talk with so many farmers.
And it was the first time for either Dave or I, why we've been to a lot of farm shows, and especially the World Dairy Expo, is a show we get to go to and meet with the international visitors. But this was our first time being the international visitors, so we kind of got to see the fun side of how the international guests do get some very special treatment, and they just were so hospitable to us, and that was a pretty cool opportunity. The closest we've gotten to see the international area at the World Dairy Expo is one year when our young son wandered up there for the free food. So yeah, but it's fun to be an international guest.
Dave, you mentioned flying in and seeing the oddly shaped fields and maybe smaller fields. Can you just talk a little more detail about once you got on the ground, what you saw in terms of the size of the farms and the infrastructure such as the roads, and how that compares to back home here in Iowa?
Yeah, definitely the average farm size is smaller. While there are some large farms, I don't think they come close to what some of our large farms are. And, they have a pretty extensive road system, but, one of their farm roads is comparable to a bike trail around here. Almost all of the fields are either hedge lined or have some sort of border grass or grass strips around them. I think a lot of that's from an environmental standpoint. They've tried to do that, but it definitely has a different look in most places. But when you would get into some areas, you could see some rolling hills and some big pastures.
And with the Brexit, as we talked about, I think that was a recurring theme that came up on nearly every farm we talked about. But it seemed like there was a real question in the minds of some of the farmers of exactly what kind of support that they were going to get from the government, and maybe that was going to differ from England to Scotland in different ways that the governments might help the farmers out.
Definitely. I remember David, again, the farmer in England, saying when he heard we were going to visit that afternoon with their government agency, which I guess the best way to describe their government agency in England is it's a combination of the EPA and the USDA all rolled together. He said, when you get there, ask them, how do you plan to take care of the farmers? How are you going to balance all these restrictions with the need to feed the people? And he shared that for the first time this winter, there were people that actually saw empty shelves. And he says, maybe that's going to make the consumers realize that we need our home production, that we have to learn how to take care of our farmers. So there's definitely some big concerns there moving forward. If they don't even have enough food there to keep their shelves full, they've got to have good trade policies in place soon.
Now, you've both been involved in Farm Bureau and various dairy groups for a while. You mentioned that you've had the chance to maybe go to the World Dairy Expo, things like that. What value do you see in travel opportunities to see agriculture and meet with farmers in different parts of the United States or different countries like we did with England and Scotland?
We've been lucky enough since our youth to be able to take part in different organizations and I really feel like travel has been a way to open our perspective on the world. You know, we all have some similarities and we all have some differences, and it gives you a perspective that other people sometimes have a different opinion because they have different circumstances around them.
I think another thing we've learned by traveling is that food is important to everyone. I mean, we all know that, but yet when food's readily available, people seem to have a lot of other problems. But Dave and I have had the chance to be to Uganda, and when food's not available, people have one problem. Where's my next meal coming from? So your view of agriculture is different depending on what circumstances you are blessed to live in.
Yeah, just to wrap up here, is there anything else about the trip? We got to see London, a big city, and then travel out to the countryside, go up to Scotland where the landscape was vastly different. Anything else? Final parting thoughts about the trip?
I just really enjoyed the people that we traveled with, too, from Iowa. I had a little bit of a relationship with a few people, and I'd worked with a few of them, but it really became a big, happy family. I felt like we really got along well and shared with each other in the journey.
I just was sharing with a friend of mine this morning that was one of my favorite parts of the trip, that regardless who you were ending up sitting by in the bus or at dinner, you were going to have a great conversation. And they're like, really? Of the whole group? I'm like, yes, it was a wonderful group of people. And the other thing was just the history of countries that are so much older than ours. And we love history, and getting a chance to see the old castles and see things the Romans left behind, walk by the Tower of London and all the stories with that. It was an amazing trip and put together so well.
Okay, well, thanks to both of you for joining the podcast and sharing some of your thoughts on the market study tour. And we'll encourage folks, if we do these in the future, to sign up.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
There's no better ambassador for U.S. agriculture than real U.S. farmers, and we're so grateful to have Dave, Pam, and all of the 20 farmer members who represented Iowa so well on this year's market study tour of the United Kingdom. Iowa wins when farmers take the time to share their stories with folks in this country and around the world. And with that in mind, I'd certainly encourage you to keep your eyes and ears open for future tours available through Iowa Farm Bureau. And if you're someone who already knows that you'd like to participate in one of our future market study tours, shoot us an email at podcast@ifbf.org, and we'll be happy to pass your information along to Dr. Christopher Pudens to keep on hand as he plans future market study tour opportunities. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you learned something new about the relationship between U.S. and U.K. ag, and that you'll join us for the next episode on July 31st. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.